Okay, continuing with our discussion regarding the particular English approaches to colonization in the New World, especially when compared to the early Europeans. And we're on number three now. And of course, the central concept here is decentralization. We just discussed decentralized religious authority, and it certainly applies, that is to say, decentralization to political authority, right? In other words, there's no central political authority that's emanating from England, um, particularly, the monarch or parliament, right? They are not in control, absolute control of what's happening in the New World. And this is so different from the Spanish example, especially where, as we recall, the monarch pretty much mandated settlement approaches, settlement patterns, even economic policies. Once they said, for example, that the encomienda system had to be replaced with one that was more humane, if you recall that, that's what happened, right? So we don't see that particular instance of political control from a central authority with the English settlement in the New World. That is to say, you're going to see different, different groups, migratory groups of English persons, right? And they're going to settle in different geographical areas of the New World. And once they settle, let's say they form a town, and they will come up with their own laws and their own political institutions, right? And moreover, those laws or institutions really have no authority beyond that community or that colony. All right. So let's say we have Massachusetts, and the political authority there would be called the Massachusetts Charter. Okay, this is what they established as their sort of political institution there. Needless to say, the Massachusetts Charter does not apply to Pennsylvania, does not apply to Maryland, does not apply to Virginia. Okay, it only is applicable to Massachusetts. Same too with the political institution Virginia. That would be called the House of Burgesses. Okay, it's spelled Burgesses, and I'm sure your book talks about the House of Burgesses in Virginia. But my main point here is that the House of Burgesses has no political control in other parts of English America, like Pennsylvania or Puritan New England. Okay, so another way of saying this is that all politics is local. It's all provincial. It depends on where you are. Now, we don't want to overstate the degree to which this is true, okay? Because we don't want to get the impression that the monarchy and parliament had no say whatsoever. Of course they did, because ultimately all the migrants in the New World are English subjects that are supposed to be loyal to, the English crown, right? So they did have some control. We'll talk about some laws, particularly in Parliament's attempt to regulate trade in the New World. They're called the Navigation Acts, but that's something for the future lecture. If you notice number three, you see this term here, salutary neglect. So what is this? Salutary neglect, well, salutary, the word itself refers to beneficial, right? For example, if your doctor who sees you finds out you have diabetes, he's going to prescribe a salutary diet for you, right? So it's something that's beneficial. So if you put that together with neglect, you have this interesting idea of neglect being beneficial. So salutary neglect is basically the official approach that was assumed by Parliament when it came to their relations with the colonies in the New World in North America. Okay, they decided, in other words, it was beneficial for England to sort of neglect these colonies. In other words, not to dominate them so much in their everyday affairs. Let them thrive on their own, both politically and economically. Okay, they felt that it would be beneficial to do that, to be more hands off, and hopefully it would allow the colonies to grow and to eventually flourish and to become these crucial commercial capitals of the English transatlantic trade system. And sure enough, that did indeed materialize. You know, the colonies before the American Revolution, by the mid 1700s, were indeed these very important commercial capitals, places like Philadelphia and Boston, New York. Okay, so solitary neglect, in other words, reflects this overarching attitude or outlook when it comes to British control. They don't want to centralize it, right? And therefore it's decentralized. Again, all politics is local. All right, so what does this have to do with American culture? Hopefully that's apparent to you, okay? Just think, for example, of our Constitution. Now, our Constitution, as you might know, is basically a blueprint for a federal government, right? It talks about, after the preamble, and by the way, we will read the Constitution, right? After the preamble, it introduces, you know, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial, and then some other articles of the Constitution. And included at the end are amendments, right? The Constitution itself is supposed to be, again, this architectonic of central government. But if you notice, there's such a thing as checks and balances, okay? And if you don't know that term yet, most of you know it if you're, of course, educated in the American, you know, educational system. But I understand that some of you are educated abroad, right? So you might not know checks and balances, and we'll cover it in depth when we get to that part of the course. But it's this basic idea that you have the system. For example, we have three institutions according to the Constitution, right? We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And the way it's supposed to work, if you read the Constitution and the distribution or enumeration of powers, they're supposed to prevent another institution from getting too much power. Okay, you're supposed to check it, right? And ultimately it becomes balanced, a sort of a balanced approach to power. All right, so again, we'll talk about this in a later lecture. But the whole concept about or concerning this idea of checks and balances keeps the federal government from being too centralized. Okay, so my point here is that the framers of the Constitution recognized this notion of decentralization as being fundamental, as being part and parcel, if you will, of the American attitude. Right, that there's this serious mistrust of a government that's too centralized. Another way that it's going to affect the American political scene is what's called federalism. Okay, and federalism is basically, again, it's a balance between state laws and federal law. Okay, so they're supposed to check each other in principle, in theory. So decentralized political control, again, has its origins with early English settlement. It was like that from the beginning. And then, roughly 150 or so years later, right, when we have the establishment of our republic, the United States of America, that belief in decentralized political authority will continue. And we'll see it, again, reflected in our Constitution, and, you know, the interplay between state laws and federal laws and so forth. Okay, and even when you think about the president, for example, the president has a limit in his term, right, of 4 years, and he gets reelected. You don't want someone to be in this executive position, right, for too long, because that is too indicative or bespeaks this sort of monarch, right, the central power, and we want to avoid that. So even the notion of an executive and other really elected officials, they don't have life terms except, you probably know if you know your civics, except for what? Supreme Court justice, right? Okay, so again, we'll discuss that in a future lecture. So that's number 3. And by the way, I should raise this question. Number 3 is going to figure prominently in the eventual American Revolution. Again, century and a half later from early English settlement, right, that we have here that we're discussing at this point in the course. Perhaps you could see the link there if you know anything about the American Revolution. Well, the revolutionaries, if you will, we call them patriots, right? Basically perceived the attempt by the British to raise taxes on them as an attempt to centralize their control politically, right, over the colonies, as this attempt to break from, quote, salutary neglect. So, by 1760, 1770, certainly this idea of an overarching political control emanating from across the Atlantic was unpalatable for a lot, not all, but a lot of colonials at that time, enough so that they're willing to separate from the mother country, even engage in war with, the mighty English Empire, the most powerful navy in the world. The colonies didn't even have a colonial navy, right? Any sort of military institution. So, all right, again, that's stuff for another lecture in the future. All right, so moving on to number 4, we see the English tradition of freedom. And basically what this is what's happening in England in terms of the intellectual circles there, you see various thinkers and philosophers starting to entertain the notion that, in contrast to feudalism, and let me remind you, feudalism assumes a very rigid and unflexible social hierarchy as part of the social fabric of feudalism, right? In other words, if one was born a peasant, near the bottom of the hierarchy, right? Well, you're going to die a peasant. There's no such thing as upward mobility, right? And same if you're at the very top. If you're born into the noble class, aristocracy, let alone monarchy, well, you are there till you die, and you can't, go beneath that. It's very fixed. It's very rigid. Okay. If you're at the bottom, according to feudalism, there's this prevailing idea or assumption that you have no rights whatsoever. You're a mere peasant, let alone, slaves, right? No freedom. But what's happening in England are certain intellectual currents that are rethinking the relationship between those who ruled and those who are rulers. Okay, the relationship between rulers and the ruled. And in fact, it's coming to the point where the ruled, so to say, it is believed should or actually do have such a thing as rights. The term they used is natural rights. Okay, when you use the term natural rights, it means that you are born with rights upon birth, right? You have rights. It's not something you gain, it's something you're born with. Now, this is a profound departure from that feudal worldview, okay, where you don't have rights. So what we see happening in England, by the way, I mentioned Parliament. Parliament is an example of this idea of rethinking freedom. And this happened, Parliament was actually formed during the medieval period, right? At the height of, the Dark Ages, so to speak. But it was this attempt for the nobility, at least, at the very beginning of the Parliament's history, to obtain some freedom from the king to attempt to check the king's balance. But eventually, you see Parliament add another chamber. Just like our Congress has two chambers, right? The Senate and the House of Representatives. So too does England's Parliament even today, right? They have two chambers. The House of Lords. Look at that. That's very feudal sounding, right? Lords. And the House of Commons. So in Parliament's history, they actually add the House of Commons, and that indicates what? It indicates that people should have a say in legislation, right? There should be this political institution that's part of Parliament where the people should express a voice. Okay, now you don't want to exaggerate the extent or, yeah, the amount of power that the commoner has. It's not really a lot, but you do have these representatives basically representing them, right, in Parliament, serving as a voice for them. Okay, so what's happening in England, excuse me, is this idea that freedom is or should be enjoyed by practically everyone. Okay, certainly not slaves, but the commoner, the person of common rank, of ordinary rank. Okay, and in England, it's definitely true that their intellectuals and thinkers are at the forefront of this kind of thinking. And of course, we call this thinking modern political thought, right? Things like democracy and freedom and equality, right? The English are innovating, really. In fact, you could actually claim, you could argue here quite plausibly, a form of English exceptionalism, right? In that they are forging this path which has these articles of faith, right, like freedom and democracy and so forth, that really the rest of the modern world will pursue, right? They'll find it attractive, worth giving your life for, right, just to pursue happiness, right? So, going back to the New World, right? What's going to happen here are those migrants, certainly not all. In fact, we're going to talk about indentured servants pretty soon. Okay, they're going to be on this interesting sort of limbo between freedom and slavery. Okay, but this idea that freedom is more widespread. I'm going to use that adjective for now. Okay, widespread than Europe. Okay. Europe is still mired in feudalism. It's, slowly starting to break through or break out of feudalism. But when we look at English settlement in the New World, we see things like freedom being assumed by a lot of people. And moreover, we see that there is no pure form of feudalism in the English colonies. That's very important to recognize here. In America's history, United States of America, our history, even during the colonial period before July 4th, 1776, right, between 1607, which is of course the establishment of Jamestown, and July 4th, 1776, we have never had a purely feudal past. We've never adopted a pure feudalism. Now, there were some feudal institutions like slavery. That's probably the biggest one. And we'll talk about some other cultural habits that were around during the colonial period in a future lecture. But for the most part, the political worlds, when it came to the common person, right, you're going to see upward mobility more possible in the New World, at least from English persons, right, English migrants, compared to English persons in the mother country of England. There's more possibilities here. All right, so that wraps up our comparative analysis. So hopefully you've not only gained this comparative viewpoint, right, and how to look at later English settlement versus the early Europeans, but you have an understanding of how the approaches and the ambitions and the patterns, settlement patterns, actually are going to influence or shape the American attitude, the American outlook, right? Things like decentralized government, freedom of conscience and, religious practice, even, more negative stuff like, no ethnic mixing or racial mixing, right? No miscegenation, and certainly positive stuff, right? Things like freedom and this rejection of monarchy. Okay, so that'll finish this video. We'll move to the next.